Welcome, everybody. Welcome to another community conversation hosted by MP Paul Manley. Today, Paul is going to be speaking to Julie Chadwick. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the unceded traditional territory of the Snuneymuxw First Nations, and that the riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith includes the unceded territories of the Snuneymuxw, Nanawas, Stiminis, and Layaxton First Nations. Before I pass it on to Paul, I would like to invite people to engage in the YouTube chat box. You can write down questions, which I will pass on to Paul and Julie. And I'd like to also thank Lori for being the moderator today in the YouTube chat box, and to please ask everybody to be respectful of each other and of the speakers in the chat. So now I'm going to pass things over to Paul.
Thanks, Alon. Hi, everybody. You're having a lovely evening. So it is indeed an honor and privilege for me to be the member of Parliament serving the communities within the territories of Snuneymuxw, Snuneymuxw, Stiminis, and Layaxton. And it's, I guess I could do an update, but I just did a town hall meeting a couple of weeks ago. So there's a fresh YouTube video there to watch to get an idea of what I've been doing. I think maybe the news since that town hall is we're in a full filibuster on Bill C-10, the Broadcasting Act, as you've no doubt heard. Part of that act had one of the amendments pulled on it. There's 120 amendments to that bill, 27 of which I put forward. That's a very flawed piece of legislation. The government has a whole bunch of their own amendments to it. And there was two clauses in there, one that said that users of social media platforms were exempt from the Broadcasting Act. And the other one was that the content that users posted to social media was exempt from the Broadcasting Act. And that second clause was pulled. It wasn't in the package for amendments. There was no debate about taking that clause out. There was no dissent. There was no recorded vote. It was passed on division. And so we have this big mess with Bill C-10. I guess that's the main piece of news. But tonight I have with me Julie Chadwick, and I'm just getting a text that my volume's too low, so I got to put on Mr. Pinchy here. Just hold on a second.
I cannot stand wearing this all day long. Is that better? Can you hear me better now? This is what I have to wear in the House of Commons, so the interpreters can tell what I have to say. And all day long, this is stuck on my head in virtual Parliament. But yeah, today I've got Julie Chadwick here for a community conversation. She's a published author and journalist. Many of you in the Nanaimo Ladysmith would know her work in many different publications, and most recently, The Discourse. So welcome, Julie. I'm going to let you introduce yourself and tell us, how long have you been with The Discourse, and how did you get there?
Thanks. Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me. Yes, your volume's much better with Mr. Pinchy. Yeah, so I've been with The Discourse, I think, till about since about October. And when I first heard about them, I heard about them through a former colleague of mine at the Nanaimo Daily News. So I worked for several years at the Daily News. People might be familiar with my reporting there. And then after that, as you said, I did a book called The Man Who Carried Cash. And then I was freelancing for a while for a lot of different publications. And I kind of got, like, I really wanted to use all of the skills that I had acquired since my Daily News days and really, like, get back into local reporting. I really missed it. And I really missed the community connection. And I felt like I knew a lot of people here and I could do a lot of good work. It takes a lot to get into a community and to get to know a lot of contacts and stuff. So I really wanted to get back to that. And so I had heard that The Discourse was looking for people. And so initially I kind of did the usual pitch of kind of telling them a bunch of stories in our initial conversation, kind of like beat related stories of things that were happening or things that weren't being covered or things that I thought was important. And they kind of stopped me. I was talking with Lindsay, the editor at the time, and she was like, do you know exactly what we do? And I had looked at a bunch of their stories, but I didn't really realize exactly how they approached media and journalism, which is kind of different. So they explained to me, and I've come to understand they do like community engagement journalism. So they go to the community first and ask, what do people want? And a lot of it is really issues based. And when I came on board, they had already done a lot of surveying. I think they'd surveyed like between 700 and 800 people in Nanaimo, just saying like, what are the issues that are important to you? What do you want to be covered more in depth? Because that is kind of our specialty, is doing really in-depth reporting over several weeks into different issues. So what came up at that time was two main issues. One was basically what's going on with downtown Nanaimo, and another one was passenger rail on Vancouver Island. So they had already got a really amazing reporter, Jesse Winter, to look into the passenger rail. He did a series on that. And they were looking for someone to essentially look into downtown Nanaimo. The subject matter was pretty broad. So I pitched them a few different stories, some of which turned out to be whole series. One was about like abandoned buildings downtown, which I did a series on. And another one was about homelessness. At the time, there was a tent city, a smallish tent city on Wesley Street. And that's kind of where we started. And then they used those series as like kind of pop-up coverage to see what the interest was, to gauge interest. And then from there, they decided to open up like basically a discourse bureau. And since then we've had other freelancers come in and do subjects, like do stories on the subjects that we've picked. And actually I wanted to mention before I forget, we're doing a wrap-up event on May 19th, like a little conversation with some of the freelancers and myself and Lauren. And I can mention the time later, but we'll be doing like a similar kind of wrap up to look at all this stuff that we covered, because we covered a lot of ground with both the series on homelessness and then the series on rental affordability.
Yeah, so those two subjects, I mean, I get a lot of emails about both of those subjects. The abandoned buildings and the stuff that's going around downtown, those buildings, that's not my jurisdiction at all. No. So, when people write me emails and want to know what I'm going to do about the A and B sound building, not in my bailiwick. But housing and homelessness do fit under federal jurisdiction. It was something that was abandoned. Actually, the federal government played a big role in the 60s and 70s and early 80s in affordable housing through subsidies, through supporting co-op housing, which I'm a huge believer in the co-op housing model. We didn't get co-op housing in Nanaimo at the time when that co-op movement was happening, because there was lots of affordable, low rent housing available. So there wasn't a real need for co-op housing, but I love co-op housing because it's a model where you have a community and your rent is based on your income. So if you lose your job, you don't lose your home, you stay within your little community and you pay less rent. And if you retire, you're still living in the same complex with families with young children, and you have all these community connections. And so much of what we've lost is a sense of community. So many of us don't know our neighbors. And co-op housing is a model that's not just affordable, but it's very community-based. In the late 80s, the federal government started to pull out of housing. I know during the Mulrooney years, they started to cut social programs. And by 1993, they completely cut funding for affordable housing, the federal government, and downloaded it to the provinces. And most provinces just continued that download onto municipalities. In British Columbia and Quebec, they both have housing. So we have BC Housing here, a provincially run agency, and in Quebec they have something similar. But in places like Ontario, it was just downloaded further. So with the new Liberal government, they recognized what has been in the the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and a number of other declarations referring to human rights, that housing is a human right. And so the National Housing Strategy came out and recognized right off the top that housing is a human right, and that the federal government has a role to play. And so that's how it's something I campaigned on, is this issue around homelessness and affordable housing. And of course, my office is right here on Dunsmuir Street. So when Wesley Street was, going full on, I still see a lot of traffic here because the safe drug site, the safe injection site is in the building and behind here. But when that homeless camp was going on, there was so much traffic, like right in front of my window. I could be talking about in virtual parliament about homelessness and drug addiction and see somebody using right outside my window, or people parking their cart and fixing themselves in the glass right in front of my spot here. So yeah. You received a lot of interest in it, and then just started to dig into the whole issue for the discourse.
That was one thing, like, as you're saying about the co-op housing, that was one thing I found really surprising when I interviewed Patrick Condon. He's a urban designer. He's a professor at UBC. He's an expert in sustainable housing. And he was talking about that. Like, virtually all the experts that I talked to pretty much agreed that a major build out of non-market housing is kind of what's needed, and that's pretty much mostly possible on a federal level. But I hadn't realized that there was such a history of it. And like you're saying, in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of co-op housing being built. And that's why Vancouver right now has a much higher rate of non-market housing than Nanaimo, like 15%, because of what was built in the 70s and 80s. And the interesting thing is that that money that's invested, like it pays itself back over time. It's not like it's a continual drain of money. Like, over time, them having invested into that land and into that property still pays off. Like, it's never a bad thing to get into real estate. And that's kind of like one of the questions that came up for me, was sort of why that ended and why that's seen as a bad idea. I mean, if all of these private enterprises are getting into the housing market, why is that something that is seen as kind of off limits almost to governments? And in many ways, I think what we're seeing now, from what I researched, is that allowing the market and the market only to govern the housing situation has kind of got us where we are. And that's, like, again, the solution that I just kept hearing from people was sort of like, there's a lot of ways that things could be tweaked, and perhaps things that could be tweaked on a municipal or provincial level. And I think really now we're kind of trying to play a game of catch up with what is really a crisis situation. But yeah, they all just kind of say, like, we need to really build out that non-market housing. And I guess for me, it kind of got to a point where it was sort of almost amazing that this sector of the economy would just be sort of left only to private interests. And I'm not even sort of saying that in an anti-capitalist way, but just in a way of, like, with healthcare and education, all that kind of stuff, like, we've sort of, we've recognized that we can't only leave that up to private interests. But yet with housing, with something like you're saying, that is so important, that is essentially like a human right, that is recognized internationally to be in that category, it's strange that we've sort of left it not only to the larger investment organizations like REITs, but also left it even to smaller private landlords who, admittedly are just kind of trying to make a living themselves. But by no means, and in many of these cases, are these people necessarily like experts in the realm of housing. And so I guess I got a picture of a really kind of chaotic situation currently, where the market's kind of out of control. And, like, this isn't just an issue for poor people. Like in my story, I cover a woman who is really decidedly upper middle class. Like, she makes more than $30 an hour, and she's in a place where she's awake at night thinking, like, she's precariously housed in an in a fairly nice rental at the moment, but it's owned by somebody else and they want to move in at some point. And the housing market is so hot right now that people have an incentive to sell. And so she's kind of at the mercy, right, of admittedly a nice landlord who's a good guy and stuff. But I think that really struck me was looking at how this isn't just an issue that is like a lower class kind of a thing, or a niche kind of a thing. This is affecting everybody all the way up to like anyone who's renting, it's just, and there's all sorts of issues, like people are penalized by having to move, like penalized by having maybe unfortunate life circumstances. I know that in many ways I got interested in this story personally because I had to move about, I don't know, 4 or 5 times in as many years. I went through a divorce. I was a single mom. The newspaper where I worked shut down. So I couldn't return to work there after I did the book. And I had to move a bunch of times, and I was lucky in that I was able to rent my sister's place, and I got another place where I had really great landlords. But I saw myself before I ever did the story. I saw like right around 2016, like within a year, rents had just jumped by, it seemed like $500, because I was looking every time I moved. I was really looking at the market, right? Looking at all the listings and stuff, and it just stayed there in my mind, this question of like, that seems crazy. Like, because Nanaimo sort of plugged along for quite a while, being like fairly affordable. And, we'd always look at Vancouver like, oh God, like look how unaffordable they are and stuff. And then suddenly it just seemed like things just shifted here. And I think, again, that was one of the things that really stuck out for me in Nanaimo's somewhat unique, although this is a Canada-wide thing. Nanaimo's somewhat unique in that it's gone up so quickly, so fast, so much, so fast. So one of the things that we looked at when we crunched some of the numbers, because the Canada Mortgage and Housing Company, their numbers are kind of a little bit lower than what's market, because they look at long-term renters as well. So they have the housing prices or the rental prices of people that have been renting for like 10 years. So it kind of drives the averages down. But we looked at a lot of the stats when it came to like current prices. So people that, like I said, like me, that were having to move many times, that are in the current market. And so we crunched the numbers based on that. And we saw that the average rent for a 2-bedroom unit had grown by 59% in less than 5 years. So I don't know, I guess I was left with the feeling, I'm kind of all over the place here, but I was left with the feeling of like, what are people doing? Like, it's scary. Like currently myself, I'm in a good situation, but like, I'm concerned. I'm worried for people. And it doesn't even seem to matter like how much money you make. Like everyone's in a precarious situation if they're renting.
I want to just step back for a second, because you asked, about why the government would stop funding housing. And it's ideological. It's also the way we look at debts and deficit. So when we build infrastructure, when we build a freeway, get a new ferry, the money that we owe to do that construction is on the books, but the actual asset isn't counted. And so we don't think of affordable housing that's been built by the government or subsidized by the government in terms of assets. And so we're always looking at what is the deficit and what is the debt, and wanting to balance the budget. But really, the cost of having homelessness or unaffordable housing is super high. And there was a business association, I don't think it was the Chamber of Commerce in Surrey, but it was a business association that calculated the cost of one woman. They followed her for a year, a woman with mental health issues, and they calculated the cost of her being homeless at $171,000 per year. And that's based on, paramedics, police, emergency services at the hospital, the shelter system, the food bank, all of the services that she needed, all of the interventions that she needed. And then they calculated if she lived in a group home and had a social worker that was there in that group home, how much would it cost for her? And it was $17,000. And so, we can't afford homelessness. The average cost of a homeless person, depending on where you are, it ranges from $45,000 a year to $60,000 a year. And so it's not affordable to have people homeless in the community, and it is an investment to ensure that people have a good place to live. And we have on one side people who want to make who think we should have a free market in terms of rentals, but also don't want to have higher minimum wages. So people who are working service jobs, where do they live? And where can they afford to live? And the whole situation, like Vancouver, part of this other ideology to this is about foreign direct investment. And the Liberals and Conservatives love foreign direct investment. They talk about it like it's a great thing, but it's not a good thing in our residential housing market. And in Vancouver, there's a lot of foreign direct investment. A lot of that money is used as tax shelter money for people who are hiding money from other countries that they don't want to pay taxes in. And because our tax system doesn't, you don't have to declare who the beneficial owner is. So you can have a proxy on paper or a numbered company, and you don't know who the beneficial owners are. And we have tax agreements with 115 different countries, including the Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas and the Isle of Man, all these tax havens. And so we're just part of this shell game. And then all the money laundering that went through too, the same thing, hiding money for organized crime, hiding money for people who are trying to extract it from other countries, from Russia or China or wherever else, oligarchs hiding money and running it through casinos, drug money as well, like for the opioid crisis. And that has all gone into real estate, and or a good portion of it. And they were looking at, I think it was 2018, it was almost $6 billion was laundered in real estate in Vancouver. So, it's quite incredible, this idea that people's homes are an asset to commodify, to bet on, and to financialize through things like real estate investment trusts or other modes of commodification. Can you, you've covered, so you've done a few of these stories. Can you tell me a little bit about the arc of your story, like where you started, where you went to?
So the idea that I had behind the stories was because we kind of really want to drive things in a solution-oriented way that is based on evidence. We really want to offer something to the community, not just kind of report on how terrible things are, but actually be engaged in. And these conversations are part of it. Be engaged in being part of the solution and looking at, okay, if this is the information that we have, where are we going with this? So a lot of the stories, mainly the way that I approached the series was kind of to look at what is the problem, and analyzing okay, where are we at currently? How bad are rental prices, or how many homeless people is there, how many people have lost their homes? And then the second story was typically, how did it get this way? So I'd go into some of the history of where did things get to? With the homelessness story, I looked into things like deinstitutionalization, which was kind of a trend throughout the 60s and 70s, with places like Riverview is probably the best example, where sort of the political left was kind of this is unjust, people are being held against their will, they should be able to be in the communities, which to a certain degree was true. And then the political right was sort of yes, these institutions are very costly, we can save all this money by shutting them down. But then some of my research into that showed that a lot of the money that was supposed to go into the community supports to look after the people once they came out of these institutions never materialized. And so people were just kind of left. And so, we have situations where I think it was 60% of the people on the streets that were surveyed by the Nanaimo Homeless Coalition, who does their count every year, 60% have mental health issues, ongoing mental health issues. 23%, I think, have acquired brain injuries, which I found really surprising. So these are, people that are suffering.
Part of that whole trend too was the repatriation of the Constitution and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And so you cannot institutionalize people against their will. And that was what was happening prior to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But that's why, like now I'm going to let you carry on, but that's exactly what happened. Was there wasn't a plan to when people were let go from Riverview. Where did they go? There wasn't a serious plan for so many of them. There weren't the resources in place.
Yeah, the resources definitely, like when you just look at the dollars, they were not reinvested. And there was a lot of communities that were just overrun, like they just were dumped with these problems and weren't given the funds and the abilities to deal with it. So that's an example of the kind of how did it get this way sort of thing. With the rental story, a lot of the how did it get this way was kind of what you were touching on there, which was not just foreign investment, but generally very broadly that there is a huge economic shift happening where there is a lot of money flowing upwards to what Patrick Condon called like the investor class, who now have such a huge amount of money to invest that real estate has just been seen as a safe bet. Especially with COVID, it was kind of this big question of where it was going to go. And, would real estate crash, especially in Canada? And, interest rates were kept really low in anticipation of there possibly being a crash of the real estate market. And then real estate just emerged as this safe place to put your money. The stock market is volatile and a lot of other investments are uncertain, and real estate is just this kind of sure bet. So that was also, part of the how did it get this way? And it's both simple and complicated, like trying to analyze how did a situation get where it is. Like there's so much history there, but I really wanted to make it accessible to people. I really wanted people to have at least a small grasp on how things got this way, because once you understand how things got the way that they are, you can then feel empowered to act. And a lot of the time these things are really understandable. Like they seem like huge issues that maybe aren't understandable, but they really are. You just have to sort of understand the way that things are working. And so that was really my goal with the second part of both of those series. And then the third part was kind of centered on just what can be done, what is being done by the city, what's working. One of the examples that I heard a lot from various experts was Vienna, who have like between 50 and 60% non-market housing that is either run by the government or different nonprofit societies. And so there's examples out there of more functional ways of running a rental market and running a housing market. So I kind of wanted to end on that sort of a note, like looking at, okay, like what out there exists. So I did those 3 parts. And then after that, we did a lot more articles that were solution oriented. So looking at like a seniors complex that is really highly functional and working really well, and what are they doing right? And looking at the rent bank that was established in Nanaimo, how are they helping? So we did a whole bunch of different, so it's kind of like a 3-part series, but then with a bunch of parts afterwards, really focused on like specific solutions that are very relevant to Nanaimo. So that was kind of the arc of both of those series.
Yeah, we're seeing municipalities do different things. Like New Westminster has a policy in place on rent evictions now, to make sure that people have a right to move back in. And same with Burnaby has put in a rezoning city tenant assistance policy. So because they've seen a lot of what's happening is a lot of affordable places are being bought up, and then there's rent evictions or demo evictions where they're just demoing the buildings and putting in larger buildings. And a lot of that's building stock that was built with subsidies way back when. And so there's things that municipalities can do. Of course, in different provinces, you're seeing where there's rent and vacancy control, like in Manitoba. You don't see things like real estate investment trusts investing there. where there's no vacancy control or rent control, like in New Brunswick, buildings are bought and the tenants are all told that your rent's going up 50% or 80% or 100%, and you got 2 months notice on that. Too bad, so sad. Here, where we have rent control, somebody buys a building, they can't do that, but what they can do is update the building and kick you out, and then jack up the rent on your you know jack up the rent for the next tenant. And in PEI, they actually have a rule that you have to justify the rent increase for renovations, and you have to show that the renovation is necessary, etc. And tie the rent increase to the renovation and the cost of the renovation. So there's a couple of questions here in the YouTube chat.
Okay.
Mike wants to know about how could a tiny home village help with the housing situation here in Nanaimo? And I'm not sure, maybe he's referring to the situation that happened in Cowichan, where there was in Duncan, actually Ladysmith, Tremanis, and a couple of places in Duncan, what they did was they set up small tent communities where they had a maximum of 12 people in them. And the one I went to in downtown Duncan was in a parking lot that they put like a fencing around, but then they had a visibility barrier so you couldn't see in. They had a security guard there at night because the vigilantes were attacking the camp at night. They provided tents, they provided water, they provided outhouses, sanitation, and they provided food. And then they changed out all of those tents for the cabins. And you did that story too, didn't you, Julie? You went down there and checked that out?
Yeah, I mentioned it in the newsletter, the one in Cowichan, the sort of little, like, kind of almost like sleeping bunks, I think they're called.
Yeah, sleeping
And
cabins.
then I did a story actually on tiny homes and whether that could be part of the solution. Part of it was that I was kind of looking into how the city essentially, and a lot of, I think there's almost nowhere, although Victoria is kind of leading the way with it, there's pretty much nowhere that you can like legally live in a tiny home full time. So I want to just look into that and sort of I don't know, like I said, there's a lot of like tweaking that can be done to the situation that could help. Whether tiny homes are like a broadly applied solution, I wouldn't say so. When I talked to the city about it, it was kind of like, yes, this is on our radar. If somebody's living in a nice place and and they're getting kicked out because they live there full time, like, yes, that's an issue and it's something that we're going to look at. But I think they're really focused on secondary suites and like sort of encouraging that, and then also looking pretty much at density. So if people want to look for like good examples of tiny home villages actually helping with the housing problem, I think Seattle's like a pretty good example where they have multiple villages. I can't remember how many they have. They have like 9 different little tiny home villages or something. And so they've managed to apply it in a way that they really use it as transitional housing though. So that's more aimed at the lowest income folks who are kind of getting off the street. And so they'll often be in a transitional tiny home before they go elsewhere.
That's the situation in Duncan. They're basically like just sleeping cabins as a transition off the street into a tent, into a sleeping cabin for the winter, and then, trying to find housing for them.
Right. And there was, I just wanted to mention as well, like there was a bill that was recently introduced by David Eby, the bill C7 or something about like renovictions, like tightening up regulations around renovictions that you're mentioning.
Yeah.
I don't know a ton about it. I that sort of came out at the time that I was rounding up the series that I was doing, but I've heard that it is like, it's potentially helpful in that realm, like what you were talking about, where there's incentive to evict, whole apartment buildings worth of people and jack up the rents. But some criticism of it has been that without vacancy control, without which we should maybe define what that is, but without there being controls on how much the rent can be jacked between tenants. If there's no limits, it could be jacked to, double, triple. Without that being kind of strongly worded, it doesn't really help that much with the situation, because it just kind of allows for rent evictions to be more officially a part of bureaucracy. So, it kind of tightens up exactly how people can be rent evicted, but it doesn't prevent them necessarily. That's kind of the impression that I got, like, personally. But
there's a balance to these things too, because you want private investment in the housing market. So you don't want to completely stifle it, but you have there, the affordable housing portion of it, I think, like subsidizing housing, when the government subsidizes housing, there should be covenants on those places so that they remain affordable. And part of what the National Housing Strategy does now is there's time limits on part of it. So with one program, after 10 years, the rents can go up. In another program, after 20 years, the rents can go up. But really, like, there's always going to be a need for affordable housing in communities. We just have another question here from Tanut about funding dedicated to new co-op housing in the future. And actually, co-op housing is one of the areas that the National Housing Strategy will put money into. I don't know about provincial funding, but that is definitely one of the avenues. It would be good to see like a more of a government dedication to helping get co-ops going and working at all levels of government to do that, because municipalities can sometimes provide land. Provincial and federal governments can provide the funding that's needed for these kind of things. And then also with Indigenous housing, like urban Indigenous housing, there is a call for Indigenous housing that is culturally appropriate. So designed by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. We have a couple of good examples of that in the community with Salish Lalem, Tillicum Lalem's youth and elder housing, which is kind of on that longhouse model with a lot of shared kind of amenities. Like they have a big shared living room. Everybody has their personal living quarters and self-contained units, but then there's a cooking area. Have you ever been there, Julie, to Salish Lalem? They got the cooking area and a kind of area where everybody can eat, and it's like co-housing in a way, right? Where there's the shared amenities where everybody can get together. And then not so much Lalem, which is on Bowen by Quarterway, and that has it's separate townhouses, but they have a community space. And then those houses are passive design, so it keeps the energy costs really low. So if you're going to build affordable housing, that's the other thing, is to make sure that we're not building cheap, so that we're wasting energy with them. We got another question here from Dennis. Can we introduce policy legislation that would emphasize residential real estate as housing for citizens first and as a commodity last? Non-principal capital gains taxation, named owners only. Yeah, I've actually got a motion that I tabled in the House of Commons that covers off on some of that, and it's motion 66. Oh, there, Lance popped it up for me. Recognizing that unaffordability, housing unaffordability is a national crisis, and list some stats there, but the calls to action in the end, recognizing that unaffordability and homelessness are twin national crises, redefine affordable housing using a better updated formula, because it is 30% of your income. But what does that mean in a community like Vancouver or in Nanaimo, or because we're looking at a range of incomes for a range of people. Removing the tax exemption for real estate investment trusts, and that's an issue that I've talked to a few different people about. Do more to regulate foreign investment in the residential real estate market. And you look at what happens in In Mexico, it's you can't buy housing in Mexico very easily, and you definitely can't buy anything on the waterfront and within a certain distance of the ocean. Foreign owners just aren't allowed. Require restrictive covenants on affordable housing units built with taxpayer subsidies to ensure that those housing units remain affordable. Create national standards to establish rent and vacancy controls. And so rent controls, that's the amount that you can increase rent for tenants every year. And then vacancy controls is how much the rent is attached to the unit. So when a tenant moves out, how much can you put the rent up? And when you do renovations, like in PEI, as I was saying, you have to justify a rent increase based on the renovation and the maintenance costs and everything like that. So there is a process for landlords to go through. And quite honestly, not all tenants are great tenants, and landlords have a lot of problems with tenants as well. Then create an empty home tax for foreign and corporate residential property owners that leave buildings and units vacant. And that's an issue that's happening around the planet with housing, where you can just, corporations invest in a building and they don't care whether they get tenants in it or not, because real estate values keep on going up. So they get a good return on it no matter what. Yeah. Increase access to affordable properties for Canadian buying homes by regulating investors out of the market for residential real estate priced below median regional prices. So basically saying, if you're going to buy a home, you got to live in the home. And then prioritize funding for nonprofit and cooperative housing. So that's the motion that I tabled in the House of Commons.
I could jump in here. Like another thing that I heard from some of the experts, just in terms of what he was saying here, Dennis, residential real estate is housing for citizens first. There's a lot that municipalities can do in terms of zoning changes. And this is something that I heard from Paul Finch at the BCGU. He's the treasurer there, and he was talking about how there's things that can be done in terms of, like, even if it is sort of a private developer that is creating housing in an area, you can, as a municipality, you can exchange density zoning for affordable, like a certain percentage of affordable housing. And that's something that is really sort of underutilized. There's also areas of the city you can designate as rental only to increase the rental stock. But one thing that I thought was really interesting when I interviewed Michael Brooks from RealPAC, which is essentially like sort of like a lobby group for investment interests and for the real estate market, I guess is how I would summarize it. One area that he kind of agreed on, other experts with, I think everybody agreed on, was that it's kind of a lot to ask the private sector to provide affordable housing. And he was really frank about it. He was kind of like, if you're asking us to provide affordable housing, we're going to cut corners. Like, we exist to invest and make money. And like, there's nothing wrong with that. That is just the way that it is. And that's the thing with these real estate investment trusts. Like, I know people that have money invested in REITs. They're not evil per se. They're just doing what the market allows them to do. And if there's money to be made from like evicting people and raising their rents, and they can make a return for their shareholders, they're going to do it. So, if the incentive exists, if there is no vacancy control and they can evict people and raise the rents, then it's going to happen. And I think if you regulate REITs and restrict them without changing the market, without increasing the amount of non-market housing that people can have access to, then this is just going to keep happening. So again, like, I think everybody agreed in a way that, like, to leave it up to the private sector to create affordable housing, it's just not really their area of expertise, let's say. Like, and again, like, that's fine. Like, I think he was really, it was really interesting to hear him being so, like, straight up about it, because I think that is the situation. Like, and that's the same for a lot of things that are basic human rights, like, that you want to keep commodification away to a certain degree, or at least, maybe half or something, a certain percentage. You need a certain percentage that isn't commodified because it's a necessity, right? Same as healthcare and education in a lot of other areas.
Yeah. The problem with some of these real estate investment trusts is where they're monopolizing. And in the north, in Iqaluit and in Yellowknife, I think it's in Iqaluit, the one REIT controls 74% of the rental market, and in Yellowknife it's 80%. And
Wow.
they prioritize rentals to government workers and to resource sector workers, and they blacklist locals and predominantly
Wow.
Indigenous people. And the homeless rate in Yellowknife is 10%, and 90% of the homeless are Indigenous.
Wow.
And so that is just out of control monopolization of the market. And so what's happening with the real estate investment trust, because I met with one of the local REITs here, and they're a small island real estate investment trust. There's huge ones like Can REIT and that are buying up units like crazy. And the more people throw money into these investment trusts, because they're just flow through, which is why they don't pay taxes, they're flow through, they have to just invest that money right away. And so they're just buying up more and more and more. And because they want to get a return, that is the way to get a return, is through what we call gentrification, which is to take low rent districts and turn them into high rent districts. And if that is happening at too rapid a rate, then it's displacing people at a massive rate. And so that's a huge problem. Mike was just mentioning about cottage homes. Might be another viable way to help house people, and that's like carriage homes, cottage homes. Adding densification, which is something that's going on in the city. And then Dennis,
I think also, sorry, if he's also meaning like carriage homes and stuff, I think the other issue there though is that, expecting like individual homeowners to create another suite or another like little home in the backyard, like lumber prices are totally out of control. This is like, it's a lot to ask, I think, as well, like not just the private sector, but it's a lot to ask kind of individual homeowners to deal with the problem, which I think has reached kind of a tipping point. Like, it's sure, carriage homes are great. Sure, secondary suites should be encouraged in many ways. Like, they're, if you're going to live in a suite, they're more appealing for families and stuff. Like, I think the city's going in the right direction with that. But we're at a point where there's a lot of people that need affordable houses. I don't know whether tiny homes and carriage homes are necessarily the only thing. Again, because it's hard for people, like if they're going to invest a bunch of money in building a carriage home, and then they want to be careful about who they rent to, and like, fair enough, like at some point sometimes they've pushed their savings to the limit building another small carriage home. And again, I feel like a lot of these are kind of a distraction from the main issue.
There's no silver bullets, just silver buckshot, right? You
have to
have multiple.
There's been decades, like you said, there's been decades of neglect in this area. There's been decades of a lack of funding in terms of the non-market housing sector. So there's a lot of catch up there's a lot of catching up to do, let's say. And a lot of these things like carriage homes are great, but they're really small in terms of how much is needed.
Yeah. Dennis has asked, can we task CMHC to develop a national housing strategy, given their national focus and access the Canadian Housing Statistics Program data? Can this agency be the de facto nonpartisan agency? In fact, I'm disabled from sharing my screen, but there is a national housing strategy. And right at the beginning of the National Housing Strategy Act, it recognizes that housing is a human right. And so the National Housing Strategy has a number of parts. If you can Google it, housing rights or human rights is right off the top. talking about that. And then there's a bunch of different programs in this to incentivize builders. There's loan programs, there's programs for municipalities and for housing organizations. So the Rapid Housing Initiative, which just came out prior to Christmas, there was an announcement. There was $1 billion, 500 million for a list of, I think, 16 cities, the major cities across Canada, not including Nanaimo, and then another 500 million that municipalities like Nanaimo and organizations like Nanaimo Affordable Housing or Tillicum Laleham or Nanaimo Aboriginal Center or any of the housing organizations in town could apply to that fund. They had $4.6 billion in applications for $1 billion worth of funds. So that they're going to renew that fund in the budget. It's still not enough to meet the demand right now for trying to deal with the homeless crisis. But it's, all steps in that direction. Another comment from the chat: there is no solution for Canadian housing issues involving the private sector. Public state-owned housing is the only way. It is part of the solution. Like we actually have to, people who can afford market housing and want market housing, they got their setup right now, although the price of housing has just gone crazy and the price of lumber has gone crazy too. And I think that's a symptom of shipping off raw logs. We've shut down all the mills on Vancouver Island, or a bunch of them, and now you watch the logs getting shipped out of Nanaimo every week, and then we wonder why we're importing timber from Oregon, where we ship the raw logs off to, and commodity prices have gone up during the pandemic. And there's just another comment here: affordable housing is disappearing faster than it can be built. That's why we can't build our way out of this. Otherwise we could. And that is true, actually. What I was reading stats about CanREIT, the world's, or the country's largest real estate investment trust, is apparently taking 14,000 units a year out of affordable housing stock and converting them into market rate housing, like bringing them up to the market rate. And we're building about 6,000 units a year. And so we're in a losing battle. 6,000
Yeah,
units.
that's one thing I found with Nanaimo was that according to the CMHC, the number of units had gone up last year, but the vacancy rate had dropped. So yeah, there's obviously like a real demand problem there. I don't know whether it's true we can't build our way out of it. I mean, if you had non-market housing that was staying non-market, then I don't know whether it really would be disappearing. I mean, like, it still exists from decades ago in Vancouver. So in some ways it's possible to build our way out of it. But I think that a comment was alluding to, like, we can't build our way out of it using only the private sector.
Yeah.
Because like you were saying, again, with the lack of vacancy control, there's just too much incentive to evict people and raise the rents.
There's
comment that just came up there. We can build our way out of it if we guarantee that the housing stays non-market. Okay, right.
Yeah, like a lot of the housing that was subsidized in the 60s and 70s to be built as rental stock, that housing had it had rent controls on it, but it was just in the market, and building, people own those buildings or companies own those buildings. Now they're being bought up and renovated or demoed. And so that affordable housing stock, because it was older stock, it was affordable because it was older. And that's part of what's disappearing when they're, when places are getting demoed. And also Nanaimo, of course, is a destination for people to retire. It's become a destination for people to escape their condos in the downtowns of cities that, want to, live somewhere where they can have a yard. And also, the snowbirds that couldn't that followed the rules and didn't go down to Florida and Arizona came to Vancouver Island.
There's
So there
definitely
were,
a flow of people moving from larger municipalities to smaller. Again, I
yeah,
talked to one of the economists at the CMHC about that, and she confirmed that that was statistically relevant. She
everywhere.
said that she couldn't necessarily say whether they were particularly moving from Vancouver to Nanaimo, but that just definitely, like, since the pandemic hit, that there's people buying, either moving to smaller municipalities because they can work online, or for a variety of reasons, or they're buying secondary houses in other locations because they're trapped at home. They want another place to be able to go to if they can afford it. So that's definitely one of the trends that's pushing the hot housing market as well.
And that's happening right across Canada. It's happening in Eastern Canada too, like where housing has been very affordable in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And now people are buying properties sight unseen for $100,000 over the asking price. And yeah, I have friends who just sold their house in Ottawa and bought a 10-acre farm in New Brunswick. This beautiful place, beautiful old lodge. And but in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, affordable housing is an issue as well, and it hadn't been in the past, just as it hadn't really been a serious problem here in Nanaimo.
I think you mentioned about the selling of non-market housing is interesting. I saw an article. It was actually discussing the housing model in Vienna. And they were talking about in the UK where council housing, there was sort of a right to buy program that was started by Thatcher, where people that were living in council housing were kind of given the opportunity to buy their own places, which sounds really great, but it ended up being quite a disaster because essentially the taxpayers paid like 3 times over. Like, they first paid to sort of in the investment of building these affordable places, and then they were sold at a pretty like subsidized price to the people that were living in them. So they kind of paid again. And then again, when it fell into private hands, essentially, as a lot of them did, where once it fell into private hands, the rents were hiked and it wasn't retrievable. And so then they had to pay because people were then a part of sort of like a rental subsidy program that they had to start, or that they had to sort of pay for people because they couldn't afford the rents that were being asked for. So that's, the UK
It's a never-ending taxpayer subsidy.
Yeah, and it's a
Yeah.
disaster.
Yeah,
Like,
that's why I asked in my motion for to have covenants on these places. If they're subsidized to be built, then it's a matter of putting maintenance money into it to keep them affordable, to keep them up in good shape, and then you still have affordable stock, and rather than having to become market and then subsidizing again, because that is part of the national housing strategy, again, part that I don't agree with. Dennis K has a comment here. He says, I don't believe the supply shortage argument. How much housing of what type do we need to build and where for prices to not only stabilize, but actually drop to median affordability, so less than 40% of your income? When are we finally going to recognize that prices are going up, not out of physical need, but simply because they can? And then he said to see SFU's Jay Gordon's publication. And I think that's totally true. It's become a hot commodity, and it's a safe bet. And it's a safe bet for foreign money as well. And that's why we're seeing a lot of foreign, money that's gone into the market in Toronto and Vancouver. And, oligarchs who have money in places that aren't as stable, where they can be punished for, and have their money taken away, or where they've embezzled money, and then they're trying to park it somewhere safe. So, and then if people have money to spare, then they are snapping up properties, and it's creating a real issue for people who aren't in the market to purchase.
On that note, we're going to wrap up because it is time. And I'd really like to thank Paul and Julie Chadwick for joining this evening on this community conversation. It was very interesting. I've really enjoyed your series, Julie, as well. Your writing has been awesome, really, really good. I'd like to encourage people to visit Paul's website, paulmanleymp.ca, paulmanleymp.ca, and you can sign up there for updates from Paul about future events, blogs, writing, and Paul's work as an MP. As well, you can follow Paul's Facebook page at facebook.com/PaulManleyMP and get notifications there as well about Paul's work and events and so on. I'd like to thank Laurie McMillan for moderating the YouTube chat today, and everybody who participated, who commented and asked questions in the chat as well. There were a couple of questions that we didn't get to, so I apologize for that. But yeah, we are out of time.
I just had one last comment. If anyone wants to continue the conversation, me and my editor Lauren and some of our other contributors are going to be chatting on May 19th at noon on Zoom and Facebook, and you can go to the discourse.ca/Nanaimo if you want to sign up for our newsletter, and you can figure out how to get our links for the conversation there. And if anyone wants to support our work, yeah, go to the discourse.ca/Nanaimo and you can find out where to support and where to get our, I do like a weekly email newsletter if people want to sign up for that.
Yeah, I love the newsletter too. It's got lots of different chunks of information in it. So I really appreciate the work that you do, Julie, and your writing. So it's been great to have you here for this conversation. And thanks to Alan and Laurie for running the gears in the back of the show.
All right. Have a good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Good night, all.